Hello, this is For the Masses podcast, and today I'm going to be talking about Russia, specifically the events in relation to Alexei Navalny and the long build-up to them, and most importantly, why Putin's government is today under more pressure than it's ever been. This is going to be really split into three parts. The first is going to deal with the long lead up and asking the question of why now. The second is really going to be dealing with the actual poisoning itself and Alexei Navalny's reaction to it and Putin's reaction to Navalny's actions. And finally, I'm going to deal with the long-term potential consequences and lessons that we can learn from this particular episode. So, first things first, why now? When thinking about Putin's government, a good place to start is the 90s. The 90s, to many Russians, is the epitome of poor government, national humiliation, social and economic inequality, and general international humiliation. This is by many Russians seen as one of the defining stories of Russia, how Russia was humiliated and betrayed in many ways by the West's promises for a better life under liberal democracy. If you think about back to the 90s, there were wars, for example the Chechnya War, huge amounts of inflation, corruption, cronyism, and generally life expectancy and quality of life dramatically declined over these years. The 90s were a very bad time for Russia, at a time when in the Western world quality of life and the sense that things were going okay, not just okay, but actually excellent, were on the rise in the West. Russia felt as it had been betrayed by the promises of the West in regards to the fall of the Soviet Union. So Putin came along, and in many respects he reversed many of these trends, or was perceived as doing so. To what extent he was actually responsible for such is up for debate. But that being said, in Putin's first few years, there is considerable evidence that he at least did provide the groundwork from which a more stable, economically flourishing Russia was able to manifest itself. So, for example, in his first year in office, there was 7% growth in GDP, and for 10 or so years there was increasing degrees of international and domestic stability and and increasing degrees of concentrated wealth, not concentrated wealth, Russian wealth. And this really continued all the way up until 2012, when things started to get a little awry for Putin. Of course, you had the odd constitutional gymnastics which Putin and his Prime Minister Medvedev, if I'm saying that correctly, which I'm almost certainly not, had with one another, and this did draw some controversy, and there was relatively widespread opposition to Putin in these years. In these years, however, Putin had another tactic. In order to reverse the trend of ritual Russian international humiliation, Putin started to step on the gas in terms of anti-Western rhetoric. The West, as you may already know, is not necessarily perceived as being a good thing by the vast majority of Russian people. There's a strong sense of anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, and a sense that liberal democracy is a hollow lie that largely works in the best interests of Western countries, and as a result of that, you get quite a strong anti-Western sentiments among the vast majority of Russia's population, especially around 2014, when looking back at the Soviet past, drew unfavourable comparisons, and the sense that when Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea against what many in the West wanted to do, that in fact seemed like a necessary pushback by most Russians, and promoted the sense that Vladimir Putin's government was doing the best it can for Russia and restoring its rightful international position as a great power. However, this strategy of annoying the West had its upsides as well as downsides as well as upsides. Putin became increasingly, I think, performative is the right word, in his style, emphasising things like the importance of a particular form of national honour, and not actually being able to deliver results in the same way that he was able to do in the early 2000s by, for example, increasing growth due to increases in things like oil prices and also increasing trade and spreading the benefits from trade and globalisation across the vast majority of his population. Especially as a result of Western sanctions that hit Russia relatively hard in the immediate aftermath of the annexation of Crimea. As a result of this, from really about 2017 to 2018, Putin became increasingly unpopular, and it became increasingly hard for Putin to maintain this narrative that he was working in the best interests of the majority of Russians, and that the majority of Russians, whatever the West would say, agree with him, and that broadly he was acting in Russia's interest. So, for example, one key example of this was a necessary reform to increase the age at which people retire. He increased the age, in 2018, he increased the age at which people retire by 5 and 8 years with men and women respectively, which was incredibly unpopular, as often raising the pension age is, but is necessary because of Russia's ageing population, and I think is one of the many examples of how an ageing population in the West is, in the developed world rather, is creating tensions within society. But really, one of the most significant things was real wage stagnation. So, for example, this year, or obviously coronavirus pandemic has influenced real wage stagnation this year, but actually real wages fell by 3.5% this year. But nevertheless, it's the case that real wages really have been stagnating for a while. And as people know, when real wages decrease, it puts pressure. It puts pressure on the government, because people feel as if their lives aren't getting better. They feel as if they can buy less with their money, and they feel as if, for example, a positive government narrative about relative success does not actually correlate with their experience on the ground. This is a trend that's often been going on in the West, in terms of things like the left behinds that voted for Brexit and Trump, and as well as Marine Le Pen, but it's interesting that this is also something that's contributed to an erosion of Putin's popular support as well. Yeah, so I think another thing to focus on before we move on to the actual events itself is the style of democracy that Russia has. Many people, especially in the West, we like to say that Russia does not have democracy at all, and there is some merit of that. Of course, you would be a fool to claim that Russia's version of democracy is the most pure form of democracy, or is one that is fair and just and delivers the best results. That being said, the Kremlin and the current Russian constitution certainly is keen to allow some degree of freedom to its opponents, and at least allow the illusion and possible hope of some to allow opposition figures to at least gain some degree of voice. Russians generally feel as if, especially because because Russia is a country with a large middle class, feels quite strongly attached to many of its freedoms, and I think that it would be very hard for Putin to declare in Russia some sort of self-styled autocracy, because there just would be massive widespread opposition from the middle classes at such a thing. As a result, you have this system which academics like to call a managed democracy. It is certainly a type of democracy, but it is certainly also a type of democracy that will not allow opposition figures to really gain government off the hands of the ruling party. It allows freedoms, but restricts those freedoms when those freedoms threaten the existence of the current ruling elite. As a result, the goal in this managed democracy is really a balancing act between allowing too many freedoms as to threaten the government and restricting two things as to make the government unpopular and cause widespread protest. So in the past this has been possible because Putin's government has had wide support. For example, at times after the Crimean crisis, Putin's support often rose all the way up to 90%. Even in 2018 it was roughly 60%. However, the problem now is that it's really quite hard to have anything, for Putin to have popularity anything above 30%, which, albeit is a significant proportion, it means that it's much harder for him to have this, to balance the two things off each other, allowing freedoms, but also preventing these freedoms from getting to the point of threatening his government. So there is a squeeze on the system, in other words, and this is really something that leads quite nicely onto part 2 of the podcast, which is, who is this Alexei Navalny? Why does he matter? And why would the government deem it necessary to poison him? And following on from that, what happened when he was poisoned? Alexei Navalny, is a blogger and an anti-corruption activist who's been around in Russian politics since really the early 2000s. He's an informal head of a pro-democratic movement, although of course he's not the official leader of any particular party, and despite his informal position as head of this broadly pro-democratic movement, there is dissatisfaction from him among anti-Kremlin activists on both the left and right. Some think that he's xenophobic and racist, and because of previous things that he's said in relation to Central Asian and Caucasian immigrants, and also is often quite nationalist in his approach to politics, and those on the right often like to emphasise the fact that he is a Western agent, and it's often in state media emphasised quite heavily that he is portrayed as such, as a Western agent, a narrative that does hold considerable sway, particularly among Russia's older population, older and more provincial population. However, despite these weaknesses, I think that nevertheless Navalny is quite a successful political figure who's able to overcome many of these disadvantages. For one, he's made an effort, unlike previous pro-democracy candidates, to go out to the regions and in order to garner support outside of just the cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. This is crucial because part of Putin's claim to power is that he represents not just sort of this swanky globalist elite, but that's present in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but the whole of Russia, warts and all, and that Russia is not generally represented by the sort of people most commonly found in sort of the neoliberal globalist West, if we are to term it that, in order to get an understanding of where the narratives are coming from. Not to say that there aren't degrees of truth in these narratives. So the fact that he's gone to regions and got support from sort of these older, more provincial demographics has meant that he's really been able to build up sort of networks right across Russia and become a really quite powerful opposition figure in his own right. One who's not just attacking Putin, but sort of coordinating many different, from all across Russia, many different sorts of dissatisfaction, and attempting to use that in order to seriously weaken Putin. The second thing is that he's often quite effectively tried to emphasize that he is anti-Putin rather than attempting to sort of build a more liberal democratic vision of democracy in sort of the Western mould. And he often focuses on anti-corruption and anti-cronyistic pieces of news or pieces of rhetoric, rather. For example, he's got a particular focus on bribery and corruption, and originally made his name as an anti-corruption blogger. For example, the recent revelations about Putin's palace are a good example of this. So, as a result of this, the combination of Putin's waning popularity and Alexei Navalny's successful strategy of bringing together dissatisfaction from the regions and the cities, Putin thought that it was necessary in order to threaten Navalny's life. We can't really know if it was he wanted to threaten his life or just scare him to the extent that he backs down. But whatever it was, the end result was that Putin poisoned him. He poisoned him by hiring 3 individuals to follow Navalny around and place Novichok, a nerve agent, in his underpants. When Navalny boarded a flight, he started, after putting these underpants on, presumably, he started screaming in pain. The plane landed, he got emergency aid, and then eventually was flown over to Berlin. From Berlin, this was in late 2019, over a few months, Navalny started to recover, and as soon as he started to recover, he said that, I am going to return to Russia. I do not want this threat of imminent debt to deter me. I am going to fight for what I think is right, which obviously is both admirable and brave in an individual, and something which really put the Kremlin on the back foot, because what this more or less did was it meant that Putin had to act. Either that Navalny would return to Russia and it would be very hard to do anything to him to neutralize him, or he attempted to either arrest him and then eventually potentially make him have an unhappy accident, and as a result of that unhappy accident, remove him from politics completely. The problem is that Navalny was such a political figure in his own right that all of these actions now potentially threatened large protests across all of Russia that were coordinated and potentially would act as a lightning rod for criticism of the regime, creating a a sense that Putin's regime was really on the back foot and potentially unsustainable. So what Putin eventually did is he decided to arrest him and thought that it is more dangerous having Navalny out there than not. And as a result, there were widespread protests across Russia, protests that potentially are likely to continue for the near future, although we cannot necessarily tell. And it's interesting that places like Ekaterinburg and Vladivostok, as well as in the regions, as well as Moscow and St. Petersburg, had many protesters present. So now let's move on to the final part, part 3, the consequences and lessons that we can learn from this, and more sort of generally, what sort of threat does Navalny or anything else, what sort of threat do they pose to Putin in the near future? Well, I think that importantly, this looks like the protests currently look like they are ones that Putin can wither. But it seems that a political calculation would be, I think, that it would be quite hard for Putin to actually go further and potentially kill him, at least in the next year or so, because it feels as if there is a relatively politically tense mood, and if he did kill him, it seemed like it would be an overreach which would threaten the Russians, which would sort of be an overreach on that side of that balancing act in a managed democracy and threaten the Russians' freedoms too much. As a result, it seems like Navalny is likely to continue in prison for the conceivable future. He has been in prison for 3.5 years formally, and is probably likely to continue for the whole of that term. That being said, it seems like it is possible that Putin could have done without this whole thing, and that in actuality, this was a bad political move. It's a quote from Talleyrand comes to mind. It was more than a crime. It was it was a mistake. It feels as if he's put himself in a position where he cannot really act any further on the person of Navalny without really causing widespread opposition to himself. The reason why I don't think that it's necessarily the case that Putin is going to be removed in revolution or anything like that, though, even if, for example, he does attempt to kill Navalny, is that often I think revolutions happen by the loss of nerve by a political elite in charge of effective repressive forces that are able to prevent, any opposition translating itself into a change in regime. Putin relies on a small elite around him who see that the fact that he is control benefits them. So it's a loose coalition of loyalist mayors who like the position they hold and are unlikely to have that position if they don't have that connection with Putin. Oligarchs, very rich oligarchs, who collect much of the wealth from Russia. Officials, and importantly as well, officials, bureaucrats and politicians surrounding Putin, who often are either self-serving or potentially convinced by the narrative of that Putin himself is spinning. As a result, I think that the most likely case is that thing that's going to happen is that pressure will come from this elite potentially for Putin to relinquish power, because Putin is becoming more of a liability than an asset when it comes to this cronyistic, self-serving elite from retaining power. Putin is a politician who was able to flexibly manoeuvre politically from sort of a relatively liberal figure in the early 2000s to a more nationalistic one now, but is increasingly isolated and repressive in his approach to power. I think that it is potentially likely that in the next few years that group of people puts pressure on him to resign. That being said, I think that in terms of Navalny's prospects, obviously they don't look good in the fact that he's in prison in Putin's regime and he is entirely likely to be poisoned. But I think that it's, in many ways, for his political career, the fact that he was arrested and it's sort of this, it means that he's been transformed into this relatively totemic figure and symbol, which in many respects I think is potentially good for his political fortunes. Instead of being a somewhat divisive individual who many accuse of being pro-Western or a racist xenophobe, he is the manifestation of a political overreach by the political establishment, which has done something immensely controversial and something that the anti-Putin forces are likely to agree upon, i.e. that Navalny should be released, and in many respects it's sort of an effect similar to Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was originally quite a controversial figure, probably more controversial than Navalny in that he often was used terroristic means in order to get what he wanted, but the fact that he was imprisoned allowed him to become a political martyr and allowed him to become magnanimous and seemingly someone which everyone could unite around. In that way, I think that Navalny's political fortunes are have never been better if he survives, which is a big if. Thank you very much for listening to my podcast on explaining what the hell is going on in Russia. I hope you enjoy, and I will probably be doing another one of these on Friday. So, thank you, bye.